The Colour of Magic by Terry Pratchett. The podcast versions of the original Facebook live readings by Matthew Ogden, the Bearded Wit. Please bear in mind, as usual, that these are live recordings, so there are the odd fluff here and there, the odd stumble, and quite often laughter, as the reader appreciates the humour along with you, the listener. Don't forget to like, share, and make sure that absolutely everybody you know that might like this is aware of these recordings. Thanks very much. Before we start, I would ask you to go over to patreon.com/thebeardedwit and become a patron of the podcast. This podcast is only possible because of the generosity of my patrons. You can become a patron from as little as $5 a month, which is the price of a good cup of coffee, or even a bad cup of coffee in some places. But that does mean that I'm able to keep recording this material and get it out there for you as soon as possible after broadcast on Facebook. So the link is patreon.com/thebeardedwit. $5 a month makes all the difference in the world to me. I'd like to thank all of the patrons that have supported me so far, and I hope the new patrons will enjoy what I do as much as everyone else does. Thanks very much. Now then, sit back, put your feet up, and enjoy the reading. Part 4. So how are you all? I hope you're all fine and dandy and super and grand. And if you're in the northern hemisphere, you're not melting. And if you're in the southern hemisphere, you're not freezing. I mean, do you ever freeze in places like Australia? I know you got mountains and you ski, but that's only because they're high. Most of the time, Australia is a boot camp for things that want to murder humans. Do you know? Okay, weird, totally off-track thing. I also, for many, many years, ran a pub quiz. And one of the questions that I found out that I thought was very amusing is there is this assumption for everybody that has sort of been to Australia or heard of Australia or knows an Australian or has watched any programs about Australia, there is this assumption that everything in Australia is trying to kill everything else in Australia because they're just, it's just wild out there. It's an insane place. It's an insane place. They have spiders that are tiny, but will kill you in seconds as soon as look at you. But, so, I found out this question, and I thought it was hysterically funny. It was like, okay, so what is the most deadly animal in Australia? And it turns out, everybody just thinks like, oh, black widow spiders, sharks, koala bears with machine guns. No, it turns out that the most deadly creature in Australia is the horse. Apparently more people are killed by horses in Australia than any other animal. Who knew? Okay, that's completely irrelevant. Thank you all for joining. This is, as I say, the 4th edition of The Colour of Magic. I will give you a recap in just a moment. But on top of that, we have the usual thing where I will ask you to become a patron of what I'm doing, The Bearded Wit, by going over to patreon.com/thebeardedwit. And for as cheap as the price of a cup of coffee a month, so that's about $5, you can get access to extra material, you can get access to ad-free material if you listen to this on the podcast, and also early access to other stuff that I'm working on. Plus it means that I can do this, which helps enormously. So if you are able to, and I don't demand that you do, but it would be grand if you could, go over to patreon.com/thebeardedwit and become a patron. And you also get a chance to sort of interact with me and let me know what you really like, what you would like me to do, and get sneak peeks, as I say, of upcoming stuff. It's going to be an interesting read. This is tea, by the way. That's all I've had. I know it sounds like I probably had something else, but there you go. So, yes, quick recap then. We are at a point in the story where we have had our first genuine wow, this is going so well. Our first genuine brush with death. And Rincewind has just bumped into death on his way trying to figure out how to find Twoflower and what to do about Twoflower. Meanwhile, Twoflower is in chains or certainly detained at the Broken Drum, whilst various guilds fight over what it is they're supposed to do with him. We have discovered the Patrician has received notification from the Agatean Empire that they want Twoflower dead. Having at first said they want him treated like royalty, they realise that if he comes back to the Agatean Empire, they are going to get other people leaving the Agatean Empire, and they don't want that to happen. So they want to off him so he doesn't come back. None of this is known to anybody, apart from the Patrician and those that have been tasked with these various jobs of offing various people. So, Twoflower thinks that all of this is absolutely wildly marvellous, because Twoflower is as naive as it's possible to get and stay in the same dimension as reality. Rincewind is desperately trying to get out of any kind of responsibility for anything ever. Sounds a bit like Boris Johnson. And only without the funny stuff. Sorry, shouldn't do political asides. It's outrageous, I know. I should be ashamed of myself. And so basically, yes, we are at a critical point, where clearly Death is on his way to the Broken Drum because something's going down that's going to require his attention. And that's where we were left. So, we've got lots of people. Hello. As I say, do feel willing to give us a wave. Hello, Victoria. Hello, Morgana. Hello, Alan. Hello, Elaine. Hello, Mum. Hello, Laura. Hello, Tracy. Hello, Simon. Hello, Niels. Good to see you. Hello, Moons. Hello, all you lovely people. Great to see you. Right, we'll crack on. Oh, first of all, sorry. A little slurp of tea. Being as English as I am. Right, here we go. Short Street, Morpork, is in fact one of the longest in the city. Filigree Street crosses its turnwise end in the manner of the crosspiece of a T. And the Broken Drum is so placed that it looks down the full length of the street. Hi, Bethan. At the furthermost end of Short Street, a dark oblong rose on hundreds of tiny legs and started to run. At first, it moved at no more than a lumbering trot, but by the time it was halfway up the street, it was moving arrow fast. A darker shadow inched its way along one of the walls of the drum, a few yards from the two trolls who were guarding the door. Rincewind was sweating. If they heard the faint clinking of the specially prepared bags at his belt. One of the trolls tapped his colleague on the shoulder, producing a noise like two pebbles being knocked together. He pointed down the starlit street. Rincewind darted from his hiding place, turned and hurled his burden through the drum's nearest window. Whittle saw it arrive. The bag arced across the room, turning slowly in the air, and burst on the edge of a table. A moment later, gold coins were rolling across the floor, spinning, glittering. The room was suddenly silent, save for the tiny noises of gold and the whimpers of the wounded. With a curse, Whittle dispatched the assassin he had been fighting. "It's a trick!" he screamed. "No one move!" 60 men and a dozen trolls froze in mid-grope. Then, for the third time, the door burst open. 2 trolls hurried through it, slammed it behind them, dropped the heavy bar across it, and fled down the stairs. Outside, there was a sudden crescendo of running feet, and, for the last time, the door opened. In fact, it exploded, the great wooden bar being hurled far across the room, and the frame itself giving way. Door and frame landed on a table, which flew into splinters. It was then that the frozen fighters noticed that there was something else in the pile of wood. It was a box, shaking itself madly to free itself of the smashed timber around it. Rincewind appeared in the ruined doorway, hurling another of his gold grenades. It smashed into a wall, showering coins. Down in the cellar, Broadman looked up, muttered to himself, and carried on with his work. His entire Spindlewinter's supply of candles had already been strewn on the floor, mixed with his store of kindling wood. Now he was attacking a barrel of lamp oil. "In sewer ants," he muttered. Oil gushed out and swirled around his feet. Whittle stormed across the floor, his face a mask of rage. Rincewind took careful aim and caught the thief full in the chest with a bag of gold. But now Emor was shouting and pointing an accusing finger. A raven swooped down from its perch in the rafters and dived at the wizard, talons open and gleaming. It didn't make it. At about the halfway point, the luggage leapt from its bed of splinters, gaped briefly in mid-air, and snapped shut. It landed lightly. Rincewind saw its lid open again slightly, just far enough for a tongue, large as a palm leaf, red as mahogany, to lick up a few errant feathers. At the same moment, the giant candle wheel fell from the ceiling, plunging the room into gloom. Rincewind, coiling himself like a spring, gave a standing jump and grasped a beam, swinging himself up into the relative safety of the roof with a strength that amazed him. "Exciting, isn't it?" said a voice by his ear. Down below, thieves, assassins, trolls, and merchants all realized at about the same moment that they were in a room made treacherous of foothold by gold coins and containing something among the suddenly menacing shapes in the semi-darkness that was absolutely horrible. As one, they made for the door, but had 24 different recollections of its exact position. High above the chaos, Rincewind stared at Twoflower. "Did you cut the lights down?" he hissed. "Yes." "How come you're up here?" "I thought I'd better not get in everyone's way." Rincewind considered this. There didn't seem to be much he could say. Sorry for the sound effects of railway in the background. Rincewind considered this. There didn't seem to be too much he could say. Twoflower added, "A real brawl! Better than anything I'd imagined. Do you think I ought to thank them? Or Or did you arrange it?" Rincewind looked at him blankly. "I think we ought to be getting down now," he said hollowly. "Everyone's gone." He dragged Twoflower across the littered floor and up the steps. They burst out into the tail end of the night. There were still a few stars, but the moon was down, and there was a faint grey glow to rimward. Most important, the street was empty. Rincewind sniffed. "Can you smell oil?" he said. Then Whittle stepped out of the shadows and tripped him up. At the top of the cellar steps, Broadman knelt down and fumbled in his tinderbox. It turned out to be damp. "I'll kill that bloody cat," he muttered, and groped for the spare box that was normally on the ledge by the door. It was missing. Broadman said a bad word. A lighted taper appeared in mid-air right beside him. "Here, take this." "Thanks," said Broadman. "Don't mention it." Broadman went to throw the taper down the steps. His hand paused in mid-air. He looked at the taper, his brow furrowing. Then he turned around and held the taper up to illuminate the scene. It didn't shed much light, but it did give the darkness a shape. "Oh, no," he breathed. "But yes," said Death. Rincewind rolled. For a moment he thought Whittle was going to spit him where he lay, but it was worse than that. He was waiting for him to get up. "I see you have a sword, wizard," he said quietly. "I suggest you rise, and we shall see how well you use it." Rincewind stood up as slowly as he dared, and drew from his belt the short sword he had taken from the guard a few hours and 100 years ago. It was a short, blunt affair, compared to Whittle's hair-thin rapier. "But I don't know how to use a sword," he wailed. "Good. You know that wizards can't be killed by edged weapons," said Rincewind desperately. Whittle smiled coldly. "So I've heard," he said. "I look forward to putting it to the test." He lunged. Rincewind caught the thrust by sheer luck, jerked his hand away in shock, deflected the second stroke by coincidence, and took the third one through his robe at heart height. There was a clink. Whittle's snarl of triumph died in his throat. He drew the sword out and prodded again at the wizard, who was rigid with terror and guilt. There was another clink, and gold coins began to drop out of the hem of the wizard's robe. "So you bleed gold, do you?" hissed Whittle. "But have you got gold concealed in that raggedy beard, you little—" As his sword went back for his final sweep, the sullen glow that had been growing in the doorway of the broken drum flickered, dimmed, and erupted into a roaring fireball that sent the walls billowing outward and carried the roof 100 feet into the air before bursting through it in a gout of red-hot tiles. Whittle stared at the boiling flames, unnerved, and Rincewind leapt He ducked under the thief's sword arm and brought his own blade around in an arc so incompetently misjudged that it hit the man flat first and jolted out of the wizard's hand. Sparks and droplets of flaming oil rained down as Whittle reached out with both gauntleted hands and grabbed Rincewind's neck, forcing him down. "You did this!" he screamed. "You and your box of trickery!" His thumb found Rincewind's windpipe. "This is it," the wizard thought. "Wherever I'm going, it can't be worse than here." Excuse me," said Twoflower. Rincewind felt the grip lessen, and now Whittle was slowly getting up, a look of absolute hatred on his face. A glowing ember landed on the wizard. He brushed it off hurriedly and scrambled to his feet. Twoflower was behind Whittle, holding the man's own needle-sharp sword, with the point resting in the small of the thief's back. Rincewind's eyes narrowed. He reached into his robe and then withdrew his hand, bunched into a fist. "Don't move," he said. Am I doing this right?" asked Twoflower anxiously. "He says he'll skewer your liver if you move," Rincewind translated freely. "I doubt it," said Whittle. "Bet?" "No." As Whittle tensed himself to turn on the tourist, Rincewind lashed out and caught the thief on the jaw. Whittle stared at him in amazement for a moment, and then quietly toppled into the mud. The wizard uncurled his stinging fist, and the roll of gold coins slipped between his throbbing fingers. He looked down at the recumbent thief. "Good grief," he gasped. He looked up and yelled as another ember landed on his neck. Flames were racing along the rooftops on either side of the street. All around him, people were hurling possessions from windows and dragging horses from smoking stables. Another explosion in the white-hot volcano that was the drum sent a whole marble mantelpiece scything overhead. "The Widdershins Gate's the nearest," Rincewind shouted above the crackle of collapsing rafters. "Come on!" He grabbed Twoflower's reluctant arm and dragged him down the street. "My luggage!" "Blast your luggage! Stay here much longer and you'll go where you don't need luggage. Come on!" screamed Rincewind. They jogged on through the crowd of frightened people leaving the area, while the wizard took great mouthfuls of cool dawn air. Something was puzzling him. "I'm sure all the candles went out," he said. "So how did the drum catch fire?" "I don't know," moaned Twoflower. "It's terrible, Rincewind. We were all getting along so well, too." Rincewind stopped in astonishment, so that another refugee cannoned into him and spun away with an oath. Getting on? Yes, a great bunch of fellows, I thought. Language was a bit of a problem, but they were so keen for me to join their party. They just wouldn't take no for an answer. Really friendly people, I thought. Rincewind started to correct him, and then realised he didn't even know how to begin. "It'll be a blow for old Broadman," Twoflower continued. "Still, he was wise. I've still got the Rhino he paid as his first premium." Rincewind didn't know the meaning of the word premium, but his mind was working fast. "You insured the drum," he said. "You bet Broadman it wouldn't catch fire." "Oh yes, standard valuation, 200 Rhino. Why do you ask?" Rincewind turned and stared at the flames racing towards them, and wondered how much of Ankh-Morpork could be bought for 200 Rhino. Quite a large piece, he decided. Only not now. Not the way those flames were moving. He glanced down at the tourist. "You," he began, and searched his memory for the worst word in the Trob tongue. The happy little Betroby didn't really know how to swear properly. "You," he repeated. Another hurrying figure bumped into him, narrowly missing him with the blade over its shoulder. Rincewind's tortured temper exploded. "You little... such a one who, while wearing a copper nose ring, stands in a footbath atop Mount Rahuarurua during a heavy thunderstorm and shouts that Alohura, goddess of lightning, has the facial features of a deceased Oloruha root." "Just doing my job," said the figure, stalking away. Every word fell as heavy as slabs of marble. Moreover, Rincewind was certain that he was the only one who heard them. He grabbed Twoflower again. "Let's get out of here," he urgently suggested. One more interesting side effect of the fire in Ankh-Morpork concerns the Insuwa ants' policy, which left the city through the ravaged roof of the Broken Drum, was wafted high into the Discworld's atmosphere on the ensuing thermal, and came to Earth several days and a few thousand miles away on an Ularuhua bush in the Betroby Islands. The simple, laughing islanders subsequently worshipped it as a god, much to the amusement of their more sophisticated neighbours. Strangely enough, the rainfall and harvests in the next few years were almost supernaturally abundant, and this led to a research team being dispatched to the islands by the Minor Religions faculty of Unseen University. Their verdict was that it only went to show. The fire, driven by the wind, spread out from the drum faster than a man could walk. The timbers of the Widdershins Gate were already on fire when Rincewind, his face blistered and reddened from the flames, reached them. By now he and Twoflower were on horseback. Mounts hadn't been that hard to obtain. A wily merchant had asked 50 times their worth, and had been left gaping when 1,000 times their worth had been pressed into his hands. They rode through just before the first of the big gate timbers descended in an explosion of sparks. Morpork was already a cauldron of flame. As they galloped up the red-lit road, Rincewind glanced sideways at his travelling companion, currently trying hard to learn to ride a horse. "Bloody hell," he thought. "He's alive. Me too. Who'd have thought it? Perhaps there is something in this reflected sound of underground spirits." It was a cumbersome phrase. Rincewind tried to get his tongue around the thick syllables that were the word in Twoflower's own language. "Ecolyrics," he tried. "Echronothics. Economics. That would do. That sounded about right." Several hundred yards downriver from the last smouldering suburb of the city, a strangely rectangular and apparently heavily waterlogged object touched the mud on the Widdershins bank. Immediately it sprouted numerous legs and scrabbled for a purchase. Hauling itself to the top of the bank, the luggage, streaked with soot, stained with water, and very, very angry, shook itself and took its bearings. Then it moved away at a brisk trot. The small and incredibly ugly imp that was perching on its lid, watching the scenery with interest. Bravd looked at the weasel and raised his eyebrows. And that's it, said Rincewind. The luggage caught up with us. Don't ask me how. Oh, is there any more wine? The weasel picked up the empty wineskin. I think you've had just about enough wine this night, he said. Bravd's forehead wrinkled. Gold is gold, he said finally. How can a man with plenty of gold consider himself poor? You're either poor or rich. It stands to reason. Rincewind hiccuped. He was finding reason rather difficult to hold on to. Well, he said, what I think is... The point is... Well, you know, Octiron. The two adventurers nodded. The strange iridescent metal was almost as highly valued in the lands around the Circle Sea as sapient pearwood, and was about as rare. A man who owned a needle made of Octiron would never lose his way, since it always pointed to the hub of the disc world, being acutely sensitive to the disc's magical field. It would also, miraculously, darn his socks. Well, my point is, you see, that gold also has its sort of magical field, sort of financial wizardry. Economics. Rincewind giggled. The weasel stood up and stretched. The sun was well up now, and the city below them was so wreathed in mists and full of foul vapours. Also gold, he decided. Even a citizen of Morpork would, at the very point of death, desert his treasure to save his skin. Time to move. The little man called Twoflower appeared to be asleep. The weasel looked down at him and shook his head. The city awaits, such as it is, he said. Thank you for a pleasant tale, wizard. What will you do now? He eyed the luggage, which immediately backed away and snapped its lid at him. Well, there are no ships leaving the city now, giggled Rincewind. I suppose we'll take the coast road to Churm. I've got to look after him, you see, but look, I didn't make it. Sure, said the weasel soothingly. He turned away and swung himself into the saddle of the horse that Bravd was holding. A few moments later, the two heroes were just specks under a cloud of dust, heading down towards the charcoal city. Rincewind stared muzzily at the recumbent tourist. At two recumbent tourists. In his somewhat defenceless state, a stray thought, wandering through the dimensions in search of a mind to harbour it, slid into his brain. Here's another fine mess you've got me into, he moaned, and slumped backwards. Mad, said the weasel. Bravd, galloping along a few feet away, nodded. All wizards get like that, he said. It's the quicksilver fumes. Rots their brains. Mushrooms, too. However, said the brown-clad one, he reached into his tunic and took out a golden disc on a short chain. Bravd raised his eyebrows. The wizard said that the little man had some sort of golden disc that told him the time, said the weasel. Arousing your cupidity, little friend. You always were an expert thief, weasel. Aye, agreed the weasel modestly. He touched the knob at the disc's rim, and it flipped open. The very small demon imprisoned within it looked up from its tiny abacus and scowled. It lacks but 10 minutes to 8 of the clock, it snarled. The lid slammed shut, almost trapping the weasel's fingers. With an oath, the weasel hurled the time-teller far out into the heather, where it possibly hit a stone. Something, in any event, caused the case to split. There was a vivid octarine flash and a whiff of brimstone as the time being vanished into whatever demonic dimension it called home. "What did you do that for?" said Bravd, who hadn't been close enough to hear the words. "Do what?" said the weasel. "I didn't do anything. Nothing happened at all. Come on, we're wasting opportunities." Bravd nodded. Together they turned their steeds and galloped towards ancient Ankh and honest enchantments. Tea. Cold tea. The Sending of Eight. Prologue. The Discworld offers sights far more impressive than those found in universes built by creators with less imagination but more mechanical aptitude. Although the Disc's sun is but an orbiting moonlet, its prominence is hardly bigger than croquet hoops. This slight drawback must be set against the tremendous sight of Great Artuin the Turtle, upon whose ancient and meteor-riddled shell the Disc ultimately rests. Sometimes, in his slow journey across the shores of infinity, he moves his country-sized head to snap at a passing comet. But perhaps the most impressive sight of all, if only because most brains, when faced with the sheer galactic enormity of Artuin, refuse to believe it, is the endless rimfall, where the seas of the Disc boil ceaselessly over the edge into space. Or perhaps it's the rimbow, the 8-coloured world-girdling rainbow that hovers in the mist-laden air over the fall. The 8th colour is octarine, caused by the scatter effect of strong sunlight on an intense magical field. Or perhaps again, it's the most magnificent sight. Or perhaps again, the most magnificent sight is the hub. There, a spire of green ice, 10 miles high, rises through the clouds and supports at its peak the realm of Dun Manifestin, the abode of the Disc gods. The Disc gods themselves, despite the splendour of the world below them, are seldom satisfied. It's embarrassing to know that one is a god of a world that only exists because every improbability curve must have its far end, especially when one can peer into other dimensions at worlds whose creators had more mechanical aptitude than imagination. No wonder, then, that the Disc gods spend more time in bickering than in omnicognizance. On this particular day, blind Io, by dint of constant vigilance, the chief of the gods, sat with his chin on his hand and looked at the gaming board on the red marble table in front of him. Blind Io had got his name because where his eye sockets should have been, there were nothing but 2 areas of blank skin. His eyes, of which he had an impressively large number, led a semi-independent life of their own. Several were currently hovering above the table. The gaming board was a carefully carved map of the Discworld, overprinted with squares. A number of beautifully modelled playing pieces were now occupying some of the squares. A human onlooker would, for example, have recognised in 2 of them the likenesses of Bravd and the Weasel. Others represented yet more heroes and champions, of which the Disc had more than an adequate supply. Still in the game were Io, Offler the Crocodile, Still in the game were Io, Offler the crocodile god, Zephyrus the god of slight breezes, Fate, and the Lady. There was an air of concentration around the board now that the lesser players had been removed from the game. Chance had been an early casualty, running her hero into a full house of armed gnolls, the result of a lucky throw by Offler. And shortly afterwards, Knight had cashed his chips, pleading an appointment with Destiny. Several minor deities had drifted up and were kibitzing over the shoulders of the players. Side bets were made that the Lady would be the next to leave the board. Her last champion of any standing was now a pinch of potash in the ruins of a still-smoking Ankh-Morpork, and there were hardly any pieces that she could promote to first rank. Blind Io took up the dice box, which was a skull whose various orifices had been stoppered with rubies, and, with several of his eyes on the Lady, he rolled 3 5s. She smiled. This was the nature of the Lady's eyes. They were bright green, lacking iris or pupil, and they glowed from within. The room was silent as she scrabbled in her box of pieces, and from the very bottom produced a couple that she set down on the board with 2 decisive clicks. The rest of the players, as one god, craned forward to peer at them. "A renegade Whippard and some fourth of Clark," said Offler the crocodile god, hindered as usual by his tusks. "Well, really?" With one claw he pushed a pile of bone-white tokens into the centre of the table. The Lady nodded slightly. She picked up the dice cup and held it as steady as a rock. Yet all the gods could hear was the 3 cubes rattling about inside. And then she sent them bouncing across the table. A 6, a 3, a 5. Something was happening to the 5, however. Battered by the chance collision of several billion molecules, the die flipped onto a point, spun gently, and came down a 7. Blind Io picked up the cube and counted the sides. "Oh, come on," he said wearily. "Play fair." The sending of 8. The road from Ankh-Morpork to Quirm is high, white and winding, a 30-league stretch of potholes and half-buried rocks that spirals around mountains and dips into cool valleys of citrus trees, crosses liana-webbed gorges on creaking rope bridges, and is generally more picturesque than useful. Picturesque. That was a new word to Rincewind. That was a new word to Rincewind the Wizard. BMGC Unseen University failed. It was one of a number he had picked up since leaving the charred ruins of Ankh-Morpork. Quaint was another one. Picturesque meant, he decided after careful observation of the scenery that inspired Twoflower to use the word, that the landscape was horribly precipitous. Quaint, when used to describe the occasional village through which they passed, meant fever-ridden and tumble-down. Twoflower was a tourist, the first ever seen on the Discworld. Tourist, Rincewind had decided, meant idiot. As they rode leisurely through the time-scented, bee-humming air, Rincewind pondered on the experiences of the last few days. While the little foreigner was obviously insane, he was also generous and considerably less lethal than half the people the wizard had mixed with in the city. Rincewind rather liked him. Disliking him would be like kicking a puppy. Currently, Twoflower was showing great interest in the theory and practice of magic. "It seems all, well, rather useless to me," he said. "I always thought that, a wizard just said the magic words and that was that. Not all this tedious memorizing." Rincewind agreed moodily. He tried to explain that magic had indeed once been wild and lawless, but had been tamed back in the mists of time by the olden ones, who bound it to obey, among other things, the law of conservation of reality. This demanded that the effort needed to achieve a goal should be the same regardless of the means used. In practical terms, this meant that, say, creating the illusion of a glass of wine was relatively easy, since it involved merely the subtle shifting of light patterns. On the other hand, lifting a genuine wine glass a few feet in the air by sheer mental energy required several hours of systematic preparation if the wizard wished to prevent the simple principle of leverage not flicking his brain out through his ears. He went on to add that some of the ancient magic could still be found in its raw state, recognizable to the initiated by the eightfold shape it made in the crystalline structure of space-time. There was the metal octyron, for example, and the gas octogen. Both radiated dangerous amounts of raw enchantment. "It's all very depressing," he finished. "Depressing?" Rincewind turned in his saddle and glanced at Twoflower's luggage, which was currently ambling along on its little legs, occasionally snapping its lid at butterflies. He sighed. "Rincewind thinks he ought to be able to harness the lightning," said the picture imp, who was observing the passing scene from the tiny doorway of the box slung around Twoflower's neck. He had spent the morning painting picturesque views and quaint scenes for his master, and had been allowed to knock off for a smoke. "When I said harness, I didn't mean harness," snapped Rincewind. I just meant that, I don't know, I just can't think of the right words. I think the world just ought to be more organised." "That's just fantasy," said Twoflower. "I know, that's the trouble." Rincewind sighed again. It was all very well going on about pure logic and how the universe was ruled by logic and the harmony of numbers, but the plain fact of the matter was that the disk was manifestly traversing space on the back of a giant turtle, and the gods had a habit of going around to atheists' houses and smashing their windows. There was a faint sound, hardly louder than the noise of the bees in the rosemary by the road. It had a curiously bony quality, as of rolling skulls or a whirling dice box. Rincewind peered around. There was no one nearby. For some reason, that worried him. Then came a slight breeze that grew and went in the space of a few heartbeats. It left the world unchanged, save in a few interesting particulars. There was now, for example, a 5-metre tall mountain troll standing in the road. It was exceptionally angry. This was because they generally are, in any case. But it was exacerbated by the fact that the sudden and instantaneous teleportation from its lair in the Ramarok Mountains 3,000 miles away and 1,000 yards closer to the rim had raised its internal temperature to a dangerous level, in accordance with the laws of the conservation of energy, so now it bared its fangs and charged. "What a strange creature," Twoflower remarked. "Is it dangerous?" "Only to people," shouted Rincewind. He drew his sword and with a smooth overarm throw completely failed to hit the troll. The blade plunged on into the heather at the side of the track. There was the faintest of sounds, like the rattle of old teeth. The sword struck a boulder concealed in the heather. Concealed, a watcher might have considered, so artfully that a moment before it had not appeared to be there at all. It sprang up like a leaping salmon, and in mid-ricochet plunged deeply into the back of the troll's grey neck. The creature grunted, and with one swipe of a claw gouged a wound in the flank of Twoflower's horse, which screamed and bolted into the trees at the roadside. The troll spun around and made a grab for Rincewind. Then its sluggish nervous system brought it the message that it was dead. It looked surprised for a moment, and then toppled over and shattered into gravel. Trolls being silicaceous life forms, their bodies reverted instantly to stone at the moment of death. Thought Rincewind as his horse reared in terror. He hung on desperately as it staggered two-legged across the road and then, screaming, turned and galloped into the woods. The sounds of hoofbeats died away, leaving the air to the hum of bees and the occasional rustle of butterfly wings. There was another sound, a strange noise for the bright time of noonday. It sounded like dice. Rincewind! The long aisles of trees threw Twoflower's voice from side to side and eventually tossed it back to him unheeded. He sat down and tried to think. Firstly, he was lost. That was vexing, but it did not worry him unduly. The forest looked quite interesting and probably held elves or gnomes. Perhaps both. In fact, on a couple of occasions he had thought he'd seen strange green faces peering down at him from the branches. Twoflower had always wanted to meet an elf. In fact, what he really wanted was to meet a dragon. But an elf would do, or a real goblin. His luggage was missing, and that was annoying. It was also starting to rain. He squirmed uncomfortably on the damp stone and tried to look on the bright side. For example, during its mad dash, his plunging horse had burst through some bushes and disturbed a she-bear with her cubs, but had gone on before the bear could react. Then it had suddenly been galloping all over the sleeping bodies of several large wolves, and again its mad speed had been such that the furious yelping had been left far behind. Nevertheless, the day was wearing on, and perhaps it would be a good idea, Twoflower thought, not to hang about in the open. Perhaps there was He racked his brains, trying to remember what sort of accommodation forests traditionally offered. Perhaps there was a gingerbread house or something. The stone really was uncomfortable. Twoflower looked down, and for the first time noticed the strange carving. It looked like a spider. Or was it a squid? Moss and lichens rather blurred the precise details, but they didn't blur the runes carved below it. Twoflower could read them clearly, and they said, "Traveller, the hospitable temple of Bel Shamharoth lies 1,000 paces hubwards." Now this was strange, Twoflower realised, because although he could read the message, the actual letters were completely unknown to him. Somehow the message was arriving in his brain without the tedious necessity of passing through his eyes. He stood up and untied his now biddable horse from a sapling. He wasn't sure which way the hub lay, but there seemed to be an old track of sorts leading away between the trees. This Bel Shamharoth seemed prepared to go out of its way to help stranded travellers. In any case, it was that or the wolves. Twoflower nodded decisively. It is interesting to note that, several hours later, a couple of wolves who were following Twoflower's scent arrived in the glade. Their green eyes fell on the strange 8-legged carving, which may indeed have been a spider, or an octopus, or may yet again have been something altogether more strange. And they immediately decided that they weren't so hungry at that. About 3 miles away, a failed wizard was hanging by his hands from a high branch in a beech tree. This was the end result of 5 minutes of crowded activity. First, an enraged she-bear had barged through the undergrowth and taken the throat out of his horse with one swipe of her paw. Then, as Rincewind had fled the carnage, he had run into a glade in which a number of irate wolves were milling about. His instructors at Unseen University, who had despaired of Rincewind's inability to master levitation, would have then been amazed at the speed with which he reached and climbed the nearest tree, without apparently ever touching it. Now there was just the matter of the snake. It was large and green, and wound itself along the branch with reptilian patience. Rincewind wondered if it was poisonous, and then chided himself for asking such a silly question. Of course it's bloody poisonous. "What are you grinning for?" he asked the figure on the next branch. "I can't help it," said Death. "Now, would you be so kind as to let go? I can't hang around all day." "I can," said Rincewind defiantly. The wolves clustered around the base of the tree and looked up with interest at their next meal, talking to himself. "It won't hurt," said Death. If words had weight, a single sentence from Death would have anchored a ship. Rincewind's arms screamed their agony at him. He scowled at the vulture-like, slightly transparent figure. "Won't hurt," he said. "Being torn apart by wolves won't hurt." He noticed another branch crossing his, dangerously narrowing one a few feet. What the hell? That doesn't make any sense. He noticed another branch, if he could just reach it. He swung himself forward, one hand outstretched. The branch, already bending, did not break. It simply made a little wet sound and twisted. Rincewind found that he was now hanging on to the end of a tongue of bark and fibre, lengthening as it peeled away from the tree. He looked down and, with a sort of fatal satisfaction, realised that he would land right on top of the biggest wolf. Now he was moving slowly as the bark peeled back in a longer and longer strip. The snake watched him thoughtfully. But the growing length of bark held. Rincewind began to congratulate himself until, looking up, he saw what he had hitherto not noticed. There was the largest hornet's nest he had ever seen, hanging right in his path. He shut his eyes tightly. "Why the troll?" he asked himself. "Everything else is just my usual luck, but why the troll? What the hell is going on?" Click. It might have been a twig snapping, except that the sound appeared to be inside Rincewind's head. Click, click. And a breeze that failed to set a single leaf a tremble. The hornet's nest was ripped from the branch as the strip passed by. It shot past the wizard's head, and he watched it grow smaller as it plummeted towards the circle of upturned muzzles. The circle suddenly closed. The circle suddenly expanded. The concerted yelp of pain as the pack fought to escape the furious cloud echoed among the trees. Rincewind grinned inanely. Rincewind's elbow nudged something. It was the tree trunk. The strip had carried him right to the end of the branch, but there were no other branches. The smooth bark beside him offered him no handholds. It offered hands, though. Two were even now thrusting through the mossy bark beside him. Slim hands, as green as young leaves. Then a shapely arm followed, and then the hammer dryad leaned right out, grasped the astonished wizard firmly, and, with that vegetable strength that can send roots questing into rock, drew him into the tree. The solid bark parted like a mist, closed like a clam. Death watched impassively. He glanced at the cloud of mayflies that were dancing their joyful zigzags near his skull. He snapped his fingers. The insect fell out of the air, but somehow it wasn't the same. And that, ladles and jelly spoons, I think is where we will leave it. Thank you so much for your company again this evening. As always, it's such a delight to read for a live audience, and there's a good bunch of you being here, which has been super. Thank you for sticking with it. There will be another episode next week. I'm not sure if it's going to be Tuesday or Wednesday yet. I will put up a new event as soon as possible on that. But if in the meantime, you can, as I say, go over to patreon.com/thebeardedwit and sign up to become a patron. Or if you want to make a one-off donation, go to, what is it? I think it's supporter.acaster.com/the-bearded-wit. Maybe. You can make a contribution there too. But thank you very much for your company. You're all fantastic. Have great evenings. This will be up. I'll put it up as a copy on the podcast as soon as possible. Probably edit it tomorrow so it can be up as soon as possible. And for those of you that joined late, I can see a couple have mentioned it. Obviously, this broadcast will be available on Facebook. I just leave it up anyway. But as I say, it is on the podcast as well, which you can find on Apple and Amazon and Spotify, basically wherever you get your podcast fix. Please do like, share. Let people know about this. It will be hugely useful for me. And do follow me on Facebook, follow me on Instagram and wherever, because that all helps with the organicness and getting this stuff out there. Thanks so much for tonight, everybody. You're all wonderful. Have great weeks and see you next week. Look after yourselves. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.